The Holy Gospel according to John, the 6th chapter. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test them, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for each of them to get just a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Now it was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward where they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. The grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you always. Yesterday, I was able to gather with friends and family to celebrate the wedding of one of our own, Chrissy Loeb. Many of you remember her angelic voice and her generous smile. I remember her constant energy in Girl Scouts. How the time goes by. We celebrate this joyous occasion with her mom, Ellen, another pillar of our community. And I started considering what it means to be a community, what binds us together and unites our hopes. In today's gospel reading, we encounter another gathering of people. Now, it is ironic that last week we had a reading that was named by one commentator as throwaway verses, with no signs or miracles or huge events. And this week, we find our reading with not one sign, but 2 enormous miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and the account of Jesus walking on the water. Now, both are familiar stories, ones that our days in Sunday school cemented in our minds. And maybe that's an issue. Maybe we are so familiar with the stories that they lose some of their majesty. Perhaps it's time to consider them with fresh eyes. With your permission, I'm going to focus my reflection on the feeding of the 5,000 for one primary reason. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that is recorded in all 4 gospel readings. That's right, with all the miracles that are recorded, it is only this one that is highlighted in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it occurred to me that if all 4 gospel writers found this miracle uniquely significant, then it is worthy of looking at again. Now, we recognize that this miracle teaches of Jesus' power, but maybe there is another lesson buried beneath the baskets of leftover food. Jesus is offering us some insight into what it means to be a community. Now, as I previously mentioned, this sign is recorded in all four Gospels. But as usual, the different writers recall the events in unique ways. So let's begin with what they agree on. Most obvious, they agree on the numbers. All the accounts record that there were 5,000 fed by 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, that 5,000 number is a bit misleading, as in first century Jerusalem, that would only have counted the men. So if you really look at it, if you include the women and the children, the number would have been significantly higher. But they all agree that there were 5,000. All of the accounts record that when all were fed, there were 12 baskets of food left over. Many scholars point out the number 12 is significant in the Hebrew Bible, primarily pointing to the 12 tribes of Israel. The number is symbolic as well as quantitative. It seems like they agree on a lot. But there are some significant things that they disagree on, primarily where this miracle took place. Mark recalls that Jesus was on the west side of the Sea of Galilee when he fed the 5,000, and then he went on to Bethsaida. Luke says that Jesus was in Bethsaida the whole time. Matthew, he doesn't really make it clear where he was. But John says Jesus was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the other side. Why is that significant? Because the west side of the Sea of Galilee was Jewish territory. The east side was Gentile territory. In other words, according to the Gospel of John from today's reading, the community that Jesus broke bread with was not part of the Jewish community. They were the others, the ones that did not belong. Another significant detail only found in the Gospel of John is that it was a boy that gave the 5 loaves and 2 fish. The other Gospel writers don't really mention who gave them the food. But in John, it is a boy. Now, when I hear of that, I quickly conjure up the image of a young child whose mom packed him a nice little lunch picnic and had a nice green grass like in the children's Bible storybooks. But that's probably not the reality. Children in that society had no value. There's no mention of any parents. No other adults have any food. Only this boy, this powerless boy. And John offers one other detail that the other writers do not. These were barley loaves. Now, to you or I, that probably doesn't mean all that much. But to those in first century Jerusalem, they would have understood. Barley is the grain of the poor. The image that John paints is that of a boy by himself with only a few bites to eat. He is poor. He is alone in a crowd. He is the marginalized. He is the unseen. And I wonder what the disciples thought when Jesus asked them to feed the crowd, this crowd of others. They must have thought he was out of his mind. Philip looks at the practicality of the situation and says, there's no way we could feed them all. It's just not possible. And let's not be too hard on Philip. He's speaking sense. Even 6 months' wages could not feed them all. In the Gospel of Matthew, the disciples suggest that Jesus send them away to go find food. That makes some sense too. I wonder if we can identify with the disciples. Sometimes when we are stuck in the scarcity mentality, we think with logic rather than with faith. Sometimes we forget that with Jesus, all things are possible. And Jesus is about to show them. But I think John is making an even stronger point. If this sign took place in Gentile territory, there may have been another reason the disciples wanted to send the people away. In first century Jerusalem, it was kind of on the edge to speak to somebody that was a Gentile. It would have been over the edge to eat with one. Just as Jesus points out in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus is redefining who is part of God's community. And let's not forget that boy, that poor, marginalized boy. That food may have been all he had to live on, and he gave it to the disciples. I assume he was intending to feed them, not expecting anything in return. He gave his last morsels to Jesus, to this man who spoke of love. Just as the Good Samaritan provided hospitality, shaking up the expectations, this boy, this other, gave all he had to Jesus. In the breaking of the bread, we are united in community. In the breaking of the bread, there is a breaking of the walls. Rather than send us away, Jesus gathers us in and sees us for who we are and welcomes us to his table. This new community is not about logic. It is about love. As I was reflecting on this passage this week, I was helping unload the order truck from the food pantry. Now, if I'm being honest, I was kind of zoning out in my thoughts and just pushing the cart over to have it loaded up. Still dwelling in the gospel, I walked down the hall to unload the bread by the bags at the other side. And as I unloaded the box of bread, I noticed another box underneath it. As I said, I had not really been paying attention when somebody loaded my cart. The other box was filled with frozen fish. I was pushing loaves and fish. And as I stared at that cart for a few moments, I considered the irony. God is still using food to reach out, to meet God's children right where they are. Then I considered the message that God was delivering on that cart. We are still called to break down the barriers, to break down walls, and to build new community. Not one built on logic, but rather built on love. In God's community, there is no other. And just as Jesus told the disciples to seek out ways to allow the community to remain together, Jesus calls us to seek new ways to reach out, to meet people where they're at, and to build the community of God, a community where all are welcome. It's interesting that the text says that when the disciples questioned Jesus, he already knew what he was going to do. He knew there was a miracle about to happen. As we look for miracles today, let us remember that that same Jesus already knows what he's going to do. He's just asking us to step out in faith. Maybe that community will be created with the breaking of the bread. Or maybe it'll be created with the roasting of a s'more. With God, all things are possible. May God use us to build a community where there are no others, where love, compassion, and acceptance binds us together. Thanks be to God.